Welcome to the Visionary Chronicles, a business strategy podcast where we provide insight to those looking for creative, executable strategies built around the latest disruptive ideas, innovative cultures, product creators, and marketing solutions. Today on the Visionary Chronicles, the next subject we'll talk about is a case study in category disruption, and this comes from the Visionary brand book, the success formula behind the world's most visionary brands. Fortunately, through you and the purchases of our loyal community, is an Amazon bestseller, so thank you for that achievement. So when we look at this category disruption, I'm going to look at a couple interesting, a case study in particular most of us are familiar with. But I thought I would start us out with a quote from one of the most brilliant minds ever, Socrates, is that true wisdom comes to each of us when we realize how little we understand about life, ourselves, and the world around us. Meaning that what Socrates was getting at is adaptation. Everything that's around us, we have to change. And if we don't change, we get left behind. So the case study that we'll talk about today is Sony versus Apple and the evolution of a product that at the time was very disruptive and how it was not adapted. And somebody took advantage of that and successfully to this day has built that disruptive market from disruption to innovation to incremental improvements, all of these along the life cycle that have carried this company, Apple, for now generations, and from being on the brink of bankruptcy to being the most valuable company on the planet. So it's an amazing story. So in 1980, long ways back, but Sony had introduced what at the time was the Walkman, and it was considered very revolutionary at the time. It was truly a disruptive product that allowed us to, for the first time, carry our music with us with headphones, and everybody thought it was a crazy invention. Nobody understood how it worked. But the problem that you see with something that's disruptive is that they don't adapt it. And what it means is that they'll just kind of bleed it out. They'll let it go for as long as it can go. In this case, with Sony's benefit, the Walkman lasted a very long time, and they were extremely successful with the Walkman. But that was also the downfall. And it was never, let's say, adapted through the generations. But the Walkman, to Sony's credit, is a testament to the leadership you attain due to market disruption. Everything had been static, which means that, you had to walk over to something. It had to be plugged in. It had to play a CD. And, we don't deal with CDs anymore as a result of what Apple had done in the music industry. But that's how it was back in the day. And that's why it was truly disruptive. So it actually played what you purchased differently. And it was significantly differently because you didn't need electricity. You put it on batteries and you carry it around with you. So those of you that remember the Walkman, it was a truly disruptive product. And as I discussed, disruption, just so for clarification, we understand the difference between innovation and disruption, is that disruption is innovation on another level. But you cannot build your innovation, what I call pipeline in the book. We talked about the innovation pipeline that was required on the supply and demand chain in order to have product on the back end for the late adopters. And then you also need product coming through the pipeline on the front end for your early adopters and innovators that are going to pay a higher price for the latest product, but you also need people on the back end, the majority, the late majority, the late adopters. So when you look at innovation, you need to build this innovation pipeline. Traditionally, on the front end, it's disruption and innovation, and on the back end, it's incremental improvements. So it could be generation 2, generation 3, whatever it happens to be. But you can't have innovation without some type of disruption in order to build your innovation pipeline. So the downfall of the Walkman was when Steve Jobs actually loved the Walkman when it was first commercialized. But here's the key. He envisioned a better way. And that's traditionally what you see with a product in the marketplace. And it could be yours, could be a service, it could be a product, could be something that you're providing to a customer, but if you don't adapt it, you get left in the dust. And this is what happened with the Walkman. It was a great product. Steve loved it, but he also felt it was frustrating. He didn't like the buttons. He didn't like have pop CD in. He didn't like there was only, at the time, 10 to 12 songs he could play in a CD. So this better way came in 2001 with the invention of the iPod. And at the time, it was 1,000 songs in your pocket, which is unheard of. So you take this, what I call this revolution of a disruption in the product category, going from 10 songs to now 1,000 songs, but the size of a cigarette pack. So it was significantly different, where the CD was probably 4 or 5 times larger than the iPod, heavier, and you couldn't carry it in your pocket. So Steve envisioned not only a more user-friendly option, but significant upgrade to how you not only received your songs, but also how you played them. So the product was truly disruptive and what I call revolutionary. From how it looked to how it was used by the consumer, it was truly what I call adaptive and intuitive. The iPod not only disrupted this product category, but also we'll talk about, which was the ultimate goal of Steve, was the record industry as well. Finding a new way to distribute songs through digital form versus vinyl or CDs, or what I call hard copies. So Steve was frustrated by the fact that you had to put a CD in the Walkman, how it played, and just the overall user friendliness of it was not what he envisioned. So through the generations since the original iPod had been invented, Apple would adapt and release many versions of the iPod most of us are familiar with. Those today, the kids may only be familiar with what's now the iPod phone, the iPhone, and many versions. And then in 2010 was the ultimate disruption of the record industry, where the Walkman was retired after selling 100 million units. Apple released iTunes, and that was a disruption beyond belief in the record industry. So as the Walkman is a testament to unbelievable disruption, but a miserable failure as far as product adaptation over the generations. So yes, they sold 100 million units, but they could have sold 1 billion units over a 30, 40-year period if they just adapted the Walkman to where the market was going and what the consumers were needing. The problem is that Sony did not have the vision. They would ask their customers what they wanted. They would give them the same product in a different variation, so everything was an incremental improvement. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the original Walkman versus the one that was retired, there's very little difference in the product, which was, for me, beyond belief for a product that sold 100 million units. So even though it was a commercial success, I feel that it could have been significantly more successful if they would have just adapted over the generations. And they may have even challenged Apple on the product going forward. So history is history. Apple is where they're at today, and Sony's where they're at today. A lot of it built off this foundation of what happened back in 2000 to 2010. So after creating their 6th generation iPod in 2010, Apple would move on to realize the true category of disruption they had originally planned in releasing iTunes. This would completely change the way records, CDs, vinyl was distributed. It effectively went through a hard copy to digital format. You talk about a disruption in the industry. This was one of the greatest ever to happen. So you can look at products as a disruption from the standpoint of competing against other products, or you can look at lateral channels of distribution with your product and make a better product that adapts to a distribution model. And that was the case here. And when you're looking at your product, your service, whatever it may be, what I want you to look at is lateral opportunities with your product or your service. And these are things that Apple's looked at, and where today is generating the highest incremental revenue increases and where their future is going to be. So you can imagine they didn't want to rest on the iPod hardware. They wanted something that they could adapt from a distribution standpoint. So when you look at where they're at today, they were now in the driver's seat with, of all things, the record industry. So they had completely changed how record distribution, or let's say in this case, song distribution, would happen. Because a lot of, back in the day, what was happening is people were downloading music, they were converting it into digital format and downloading it for free. So Apple had two advantages. Number one, they had the technology. Number two, they didn't have to deal with the piracy of Apple because Apple would charge for the music. But Apple just had such a great infrastructure in place. People didn't mind paying for that, and they had ownership of their songs, and they could select the songs they wanted without buying an album. You know, and that's the interesting thing as well. When you look at iTunes, what Steve also looked at was the consumer. Many times people buy albums, and if you remember back in the day, when you would buy an album, you maybe bought it for 2 songs, but you would have the other 8 songs you absolutely hated, but you had to pay for. So now it forces those record labels as well as recording artists to record great songs that people will be willing to pay for. So it was an advantage, quite frankly, for the creators, and also an advantage for the record industry, and also for Apple as a new distribution model. So all these pieces were falling in place for Apple. So now they were in the driver's seat, and record companies would have to come to them to adapt and understand what the future looked like according to Apple. So as with Sony, the record industry had been caught flat-footed and not prepared for what the future would bring. So being able to anticipate these changes is a cornerstone attribute for a truly visionary brand, and one Apple has succeeded in executing repeatedly, and why they now stand as the world's #1 most valuable brand from the edge of destruction. People fail to realize back in the day, Apple was on bankruptcy. They were on fumes, and Steve turned them around, and the product, the first one was the iMac, and then it went into creating notebooks, consolidating the product line, creating the iPod, a distribution model through iTunes, and then the rest is history through the iPhone. So all of these products were just absolutely obliterating the market and creating this infrastructure for Apple, but an ecosystem for Apple as well that people had to be in, which is just an unbelievable strategy that really only one company in history has been able to execute it properly, and that's Apple. So what does this category disruption process we talk about look like? So there are a couple points to successfully executing this strategy, and not all, but I'm going to give you what I would classify as the most important ones, and it comes from the book, The Visionary Brand. The first is risk versus fear of failure. Embrace risk and learn from failure. I say, people say, well, embrace failure, but you can't just keep failing and not learning anything. You need to learn from your failure. So embrace the fact that you're going to have to take risk and you're going to fail. No great product has ever been commercialized without failing first, nor has any great brand ever been generational without taking risks. The second is invent a new solution versus updating the problem. Updating the problem is incremental. Inventing a new solution is disruptive. Your choice. The third is provide what no one knew they needed. And I go back to Henry Ford, just a classic example. Hey, if I would have asked my consumer what they were looking for in transportation, they would have told me a faster horse. So we wouldn't be driving cars today. Fortunately, he didn't listen to his consumer. So provide what no one knew they needed. And I go back to the Apple example of the iPod. That hadn't been invented before. People were perfectly fine dropping CDs in the Walkman, putting the headphones on, and letting their batteries run out. Steve just felt that wasn't efficient. It was cumbersome, and it wasn't user-friendly, so he created the iPod, then the iTunes, and the distribution model for record and song industry changed forever. So the fourth is disrupt your market and others. I add others because when you look at the example we talked about in this case study, it wasn't the fact that we just created the iPod where you could drop songs on it. It was that I wanted to own the song distribution as well, which was unheard of. Apple was not in the record industry. So they knew they built a system, a process, and a product that adapted to this distribution model of the record industry, and they needed Apple in order to execute it. So Apple created it for them. So disrupt your market and find lateral markets to disrupt as well as a result of your product. The fifth is cannibalize yourself first. If you're a premium product, leadership in the category and market that you sell into, again, product, service, whatever it happens to be, you want to cannibalize your product before your competitors do. So that goes back to what I always say is these premium brands that we work with Liquid Mind, as well as ones that I've been associated with, the leaders always had this up on their board to cannibalize yourself first. Meaning that don't look at what the competitors are doing, find ways to adapt products, make your product better, whether it's an innovative incremental improvement, that's perfectly fine, that fits in the supply chain, but you also need something on the front end that's disruptive that allows you to carry that incrementally through your supply chain over generations. So cannibalize yourself first. Number 6 is show vision. Have courage and take risks. I say show vision, it's kind of a variant of a visionary brand. But showing means you're actually dedicated to the DNA of your brand and taking risk and embracing failure. So have courage and take risk as a brand. It's extremely important to your success. It's also extremely important to build loyalty both inside, outside your company, and to drive passion with those who are working for your company. So in order to disrupt or innovate, you must be committed to success. The balance between creativity, execution, and opportunity must be balanced. But never lose sight of your vision. Always instilling passion into those around you and be humble in sharing the credit, and always, always be learning. As I say, stay true, stay authentic, be different, and be great, and enjoy your journey. Thanks for listening to the Visionary Chronicles. I wanted to thank you for listening to the Visionary Chronicles podcast. And hopefully you find the information that we put out each week very useful. And what we found through reviews and when we were originally putting together their Visionary podcast was found both personal and professional advice as well as information those listening to the podcast were looking for. So we wanted to be unique in that way, and hopefully you found that to be the case. And appreciate the reviews that you've been sending in, and we would certainly appreciate you signing up for our newsletter as well, which is an expansion upon what you're seeing on or hearing on the Visionary Chronicles podcast. And you can find that at 2 locations. One is bryansmeltzer.com, BRYANSMELTZER.com, or our company site, liquidmindsite.com, LIQUIDMIND site, SITE.com. So we would appreciate any reviews, additional reviews, comments you may have. Sign up for the newsletter, and we look forward to talking with you next week.